All right. So, this is what happens when I move the time, but I appreciate you guys soldiering through and ensuring that we learn the Torah. And I'm sure some of our friends will listen to the recording later. All right. This is a very, I say every tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein that we do is a critical tshuva. I do try to kind of select what I think are the most essential, and certainly many would concur with this. But this definitely ranks up in terms of the highest stakes. We talked about Zman and we talked about how to calculate the time for Marv. And I guess in a certain sense, the stakes are high. After all, calculating when Shabbos ends, Shabbos is pretty heavy stuff. The punishments that's carried along with in the Torah, we don't need to get into that. But clearly, for people's lives here post-Holocaust, last time we talked about the post-Holocaust chuvos in terms of all of these women who survived the Holocaust and terrible Rahman al, they don't know what happened to their husbands. So Moshe basically, after going through, we won't recount all of the different considerations, but essentially after going through all the different halachic elements, he comes to the conclusion that these women can remarry. We assume if a man was seen going to the death camps and he was never heard from again after, wait a little bit of time post-war, we could assume, unfortunately, that they perished. But the good news for her is that at least she can kind of start a new chapter in her life and move on from there. So now we're going to actually jump ahead a number of years. Before we were in the 1940s, now we're jumping to 1951. Not so far later, but now Ramosha is kind of pivoting and talking about some other questions that came his way. You see, what we were trying to do originally was we had a woman who was stuck in what we would call functionally a dead marriage, right? Just for legal purposes, religious purposes, she was still considered bound to this man. But now, actually, we're going to talk about cases where Rav Moshe determined that retroactively the marriage was never took place in the first place, right? We can either try to figure out how to conclude a marriage, how to either get a get or to determine if the husband died. But at the same time, we don't. At the same time, there's another method. We'll talk about different methods, which is what if a marriage could be retroactively nullified? Now, I'm not talking about a principle. There's a principle out there called afkinu, which basically, since all marriages are, they're done under the auspices of the rabbis, like the rabbinic establishment, there's this idea that the rabbis, hey mamru ve'hey mamru, the rabbis give it, the rabbis take it away. If the rabbis are sort of overseeing the marriages, they could also dissolve a marriage. Very controversial idea to just unilaterally dissolve a marriage. But what if there were grounds for saying that she was never married in the first place? Now, when could that happen? So here's the thing. We don't say this kind of stuff at a wedding ceremony, but a wedding in Judaism is essentially a business transaction. Not the most romantic thing, I know. If you ever look at a ksuba, the ksuba is not necessarily the most romantic document either. Yes, okay, he takes the the shirt from on his back and gives it to her, but there's a lot of talks about the money and monetary amount, talks about the obligations, et cetera, et cetera. So when there's a business transaction between Reuven and Shimon, right? Let's say Reuven thought that he was buying from Shimon a dog, and then Shimon gives him a cat. So Reuven can claim mekach taos, that this was a sale under false pretenses. You did a bait and switch on me. That's not what I agreed to. There was no true meeting of the minds here, whatever you want to call it. So it's not that the transaction later is that they're doing a second transaction and returning it. It's that the first transaction that they initially agreed to was null and void because that's not what Reuven agreed to. So similarly in marriage, a woman could say, "Hey, that's not the guy I agreed to marry." Now, of course, if it's we could get into talking about Yaakov in the Torah. Think about Jacob, along with Leah, how he thought he was getting Rachel, but then he gets Leah instead. We could talk about that there. But what would be grounds in theory? You guys can jump in over here, Sandy, Lee. What do you think would be grounds for annulling a marriage retroactively on this basis?
If you don't perform your duties.
So that's an interesting suggestion. Let me see if we can refine that because, you know, the woman and the man, they can enter a marriage together, and if down the line he's not taking out the garbage like he's supposed to, or he's not cleaning the dishes and she gets upset, is that necessarily mean that she entered that marriage under false pretenses, or is it just that as time went on, she is
Oh,
becoming
I meant, sorry,
dissatisfied with it?
Rabbi, I meant different duties.
Yeah, sorry, so maybe elaborate on that for us.
I really don't want to in front of Sandy.
Oh, that's what you meant. Okay, got it. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you were still talking. Yeah, that could be one of them. But the thing is, in terms of responsibilities, um, that's not necessarily an inherent deficiency, right? What we're looking for essentially is an inherent deficiency that had the woman known about it going in, she would not want to enter into this marriage. Something as to whether one fulfills their responsibilities, or as you said before, Lee, the question is that an inherent defect, right? We're trying to find a defect.
What if he decides that he doesn't want children and she
Ooh.
and she is then left in a situation?
Okay, so Sandy, you bring up a great point. What if he decides not to have children? Let me sharpen that a little bit. What if not that he not decides that he doesn't want to have children? What if he's incapable of having children? What if he's impotent? What if he's not able to produce? Because that's a big difference. Deciding not to is not an inherent defect, but being biologically incapable of having children, that could be an inherent defect, actually. That's meaning it's more quantifiable. And indeed, if we look at this tshuva from Rav Moshe and Evan Ezer Chelagas Siman Ayin Tes, it's about be'inyan ish she'ein lo gvuras anashim, about a man who is, I'll try to put it in the most pleasant terms possible, but he's incapable of fathering a child. And indeed, if we look at the tshuva, Rav Moshe writes, I'm obviously, not obviously, but I'll pick excerpts as I always do, because if we went through an entire tshuva here, we would only cover one tshuva, the entire session, if we're lucky. This is a remarkable line. He says, many early authorities and later authorities have already addressed this issue. As you can imagine, if you ever, when I got a question on a test in high school, what's the halacha in whatever scenario? Safe bet is, what do you answer? Machlokas, it's an argument, right? That's a safe bet. So yeah, some ruled stringently, some ruled leniently. And interesting, what would be considered stringent and lenient over here. But but nobody was willing to do anything about it. This is a recurring theme, and we'll in part 3, which will hopefully be the final one, Rav Moshe reiterates this point. And this is part of what made Rav Moshe set apart from the pack. That he didn't just write a theoretical tshuva, that he was willing to actually put his weight behind it. And he takes a lot of flack for the different tshuvos that he writes. Every time he writes a controversial tshuva, everybody in the popular journals, the Haparis Anamor, every rabbi in Brooklyn writes a response to it. It's really, they had a field day. It was before Facebook. So he writes, Omach mashu inyan aguna. Right, we're talking about Igun over here. We're talking about a woman who's going to be trapped in a marriage. And she's looking for some kind of recourse. It's a mouthful. Basically saying, God, so help me. He says, I, in my humble opinion, will have to figure out a solution to this, because otherwise this woman is going to have to live the rest of her life in misery. Doesn't mean he's going to concoct halacha and make something out of nowhere, but he says, I'm committed to plumbing the depths of the literature to see if we can indeed find a solution. And just to kind of make a long story short over here, he says that we already have precedent that for someone who is a mukashchin, a man who is all covered in boils. So the question is, would a woman prefer to be with a mukashchin or not? Meaning, would she rather be with someone who has these kind of physical defects, or would she rather be alone? So there's a principle called tav lemetav tandum milametav armalu, which as a kid I always thought that last word armaloo sound like armadillos, and we got that. That's always the picture staying in my head. But what it means is that most women, we assume, would rather have a husband who is far from ideal than to live alone. Now, it's an interesting debate. This was some YU history apparently between Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Rachman. Rabbi Soloveitchik believed that this is he probably used some fancy term like an ontological reality, or I don't know, Weltanschauung, or throwing some fancy word. So meaning this is just a truth of the human condition, of human reality. While Rabbi Rachman and others, and I think Ramosha himself actually, perhaps understands that Tav L'Meitav Tandu L'Meitav Armalu is a little bit more malleable. It's a little bit more context dependent. Not all women have that preference, and it's hard to generalize it as well. But Ramosha says this is worse than being a mukashkin. A mukashkin, okay, so maybe the guy, doesn't look the best, but not to downplay that. But on the other hand, what's the purpose of marriage? Now, if obviously there's the idea of having an accompaniment, there's the idea of having a life partner. That's certainly something important. But from a strictly religious and halakhic standpoint, there's no mitzvah to get married. There's a mitzvah, be fruitful and multiply. The mitzvah is to have progeny. It's to have more children and to have the generations continue. That's kind of like the goal over here. So he says, if this man is incapable,
wouldn't marriage ensure that there's no like problems with lineage and mamzerus and everything else?
Yeah. I mean, look, in the end of the day, one is supposed to get married before having the children, right? But the idea is that arguably, and there's a lot of we can get into the thumb flips, as we call them in yeshivas. Like when they come with a good idea, they go, that's the little thing that they do. So that's what I mean when I talk about the thumb flips. It means like getting into all the nitty gritties. So yes, but the idea basically is that if he's not able to fathering children, it's not just simply that it's something that's not ideal in a partner. It's that there's an inherent deficiency in his ability to father the children, and that could be a real deficiency. That if she were aware of that going in, that would be a basis to nullify the kedushin, nullify the marriage retroactively, because she got married under false pretense. I thought I married this guy, and I thought I'd be able to have children with him. Had I known he was incapable of fathering children, I would have called it off beforehand. I mean, obviously, it depends. It's only upon hearing that news that she then wants to divorce or retroactively annul the marriage. Suffice to say, if he's willing to give a divorce document, we would much rather that. This is because sometimes it's hard to extract a divorce document, unfortunately. So in a case where you can't get a divorce document from him, maybe we could use this as recourse to just nullify the marriage. You don't need a divorce document to end the marriage if the marriage never happened in the first place. So that's the idea.
Man, God may not have known with marriage.
Yeah.
The other thing is today that's not a problem, because when somebody gets married today,
genetic testing
was already part of this.
So what you're talking about, which is part 3, or maybe who knows, maybe we'll get to it tonight, is the Base Native America's prenuptial agreement. So what the prenuptial agreement is not that there is a divorce retroactively, though some have suggested. I think the conservative movement may have attempted that. Rather, it is actually, it's spoiler alert, you're thinking that's to the end, is that they're basically going to enforce the ksuba, which is the traditional marriage document, that the man will functionally be penalized to pay a monetary fine, even though it's not really a fine. We'll get into the technicalities later. Which will incentivize him to give the get. I mean, he still has to give the divorce document, but if every month he has to pay money to support his ex-wife, or ex-wife functionally, not ex-wife halachically, then he's going to be incentivized to give the get sooner or later. But it's not that there's a get retroactively. Definitely in I would say in the yeshivish and Haredi world, most of them don't use any prenuptial agreement like this. It's mainly in the Yeshiva University and modern Orthodox world that it's caught on. And then in the Reform world, they don't have to worry about this because they just in principle don't believe in being bound to the strictures of halacha. And the conservative world's interesting because they do sign on to halacha, but I think they came out with some creative ways, kind of like what you're describing. Okay, so this is called a kiddushay tos, a marriage under false pretenses. Okay, but there are other examples where this could come up, such as in a case of a shota. So like let's say a case where whatever the circumstance might be, like that she was not aware of his mental mindset going in. There's a case over here about that as well. He writes again, reiterates the idea. It's the same phraseology. He says once again, even though who am I? I'm dust at the feet of our sages. I'm going to try to plumb the depths to find a solution for this woman. And he reiterates a lot of the ideas. I'm just looking at the sheet over here. A lot of this is reiterated. Here's another example. This is an Even Ezer Chilek Datzim and Pei Gimel. Let's say someone is a meshumad. A meshumad is basically someone who decides to leave the faith. So this woman gets married to a meshumad. She finds out he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in the Torah. He doesn't believe in Judaism. Now, here's the funny part. Shagama isha mashma shagam kein hio veris lakamitz chamuros. The funny part about this woman who wants to get out of the marriage is that she doesn't really keep the Torah herself. She doesn't really keep the mitzvos, from what we understand. But he writes, "Aval al kol panim mizeh shahalchem mimenu teichaf." Since upon hearing that he renounced Judaism, he renounced his Jewish faith, she immediately wanted to leave him. Kisha amar lashu meshumad. So therefore, Chazinan, we see Shem lo haya mitaosa lo haisa nisislo. Had he not deceived her into thinking that he would be observant, she would never have married him had she known. Bimkain hare haya kiddushay tos. This once again is a kiddushin under false pretenses, because she would not have wanted to marry him. How do I know she wouldn't want to marry him? Because upon the moment that he informed her, she said, "I want to get out of here." If she didn't react that way, she said, maybe we can make things work out. So then that wouldn't be grounds for retroactively annulling it. Moreover, he writes, interestingly, Sharov af me'ilushim shomrei Torah. Here's the thing. There are many people, even if they don't observe the mitzvahs of the Torah, even if they don't come to shul, on a Shabbos morning or on a high holidays or anything, even if they are, every day they're going in and they're getting cheeseburgers, or there's worse you could do than cheeseburgers in terms of Averos Chamuros, but I don't know, insert whatever you want. Even if someone is not, super observant, doesn't mean they want to be married to someone who renounces their Jewish faith, right? We're all at different places along our spiritual journey, right? We're all better at some than others. But the point is, we're all trying to make a good faith effort. We're all trying to do our best. But you want to be married to someone who's in principle, who's fighting against the faith. And he says there's almost a chazaka, there's almost a presumption we can have. That if someone doesn't want to intermarry, they wouldn't want to marry someone who's a meshumad either. And there's some people who would even be willing to intermarry, but they wouldn't want to marry a Jewish heretic, because that is even worse. And some people, it's funny. Again, maybe Rav Moshe Feinstein met different people. Maybe it was a different time. Just in my own experience, anecdotally, I think people, at least from my met, are more comfortable getting married to a Jewish heretic than they are getting married to someone who's not Jewish. But I don't have any data. I don't have any statistics to back it up. I only have anecdotal experiences. But that's what he writes over here. And then, oh boy, we get to our most controversial one. So, anyone think of any other inherent disqualifications in a marriage that could be grounds for annulling retroactively? Anyone want to guess the last topic?
So you're using the word annulling. You said annul. So that's basically what this is. I mean, if you're looking at reasons to annul the marriage.
Right. I guess we should sharpen what we mean by the term annul.
Right. I mean, I think you just said the word annul. So
well, I want to be don't hang up on my English too much because I might not be rendering it right. I guess what I'm trying to say is the marriage never happened. So functionally speaking, it's yeah, you can't redo the past. Like if they were living together and everything.
Not to get political or anything like that, but what if somebody
I always love when a
decides,
sentence starts that way, by the way.
what's that?
Yeah. I
No, what
always love it
happened
when people preface that way.
in this day and age, let's say somebody wants to become, something else.
Okay, good. So you're very close. So the transgender, right? That
Yeah.
that that stuff was not as well known at the time of this tshuva. The tshuva we're looking at is in. Oh, I didn't put the date on here. No, I did. It's in 1978. All right. So they didn't really know much of, I think, transgenderism then, is my understanding. Maybe transvestites or something, but not transgenderism. But what they did know about was Mishal Acher Nisuav, someone after he gets married, Nodashu Shatuf B'Mishkav Zachar. They discover that he is homosexual. They discover that he is gay. And so the question is, you have this woman who says, that's not what I signed up for. So the question is, if he's giving us a hard time in issuing a divorce document, issuing a get, can we nullify it retroactively? So what would you guys say? Is that grounds for claiming that if she was aware, she would never have entered into it? There's a marriage under false pretenses. We don't need a get. What do you guys think?
it's hard for me to think that she had no idea.
Oh, yeah? You think she wouldn't know?
I don't know. I would say it's a marriage under false pretenses, but if you know a person so intimately, no, I don't mean intimately, you know a person very well before you marry him, you would probably know that about him.
So Sandy, that's excellent. I'm glad you said that because there's an assumption you're making that they knew each other very well before getting married. This is why we have to know the culture Moshe Feinstein speaking of. He's coming from a very traditional Eastern European Russian culture where I don't know if it's necessarily arranged marriages, but you're probably not going on more than 3 dates before you decide if you're getting married or not. That's my guess.
But I think Sandy's right because when you're going to get married, I don't know if they still do this. You got to talk to the rabbi or the rabbi that's marrying you first, just so you can set. And again, you probably know I think you know what I'm talking about. It's
Cussing
like,
classes, yeah.
so
Where you run them through everything.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, look, here's the thing. You guys know better than I would. I mean, I'm a millennial. In my generation, people are much more open about being gay. But I think in the 1970s, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, people were not as comfortable being out as they are today by any stretch of the imagination. And some people, they were just convinced that it was some kind of, psychological defect they needed to overcome. Our understanding kind of this stuff has changed a lot. And I mean, a lot of it is still discussed. I don't claim to, all I have is a bachelor's in psychology, so that qualifies me for zilch. But, all I know is that the
But
DSM is, yeah.
there's a way to kind of, filter. I was to suppose there would be things to filter out because another thing that I thought of is if you find out after you get married that the husband is just abusive, where he's, battering the person and everything else. I'm not putting those in the same category, but I'm just saying that's another thing where
Yeah.
sometimes
So
we may not know.
this was okay. So I actually glossed over this tshuva. He does deal with this. This is Ebenezer Chilak Hasim Pei. Ramosha actually has a case like that, I believe. And basically, here's the thing, right? The tough part is quantifying this. So everybody has vices. Everybody has midos. We all have attributes, and we all have traits, and we all have habits that we need to, work on as people, right? So, but is that considered an inherent defect? So one can say that, again, going to the example of, not taking out the garbage or something. There's no inherent defect over there that can be quantified. But he talks about in his tshuva where they went to, I think, was it the hospital at Ferry Point or something, transliterated. Apparently there was a army hospital at Ferry Point in New York somewhere, I guess. I guess I should Google that. But if you have psychologists who say this person has, I don't know what you want to say, bipolar or insert some kind of, disorder that would make it very difficult to live with the person, and that's something that is psychologically quantifiable, then we could actually issue something like a mekach tos. We could say it was something that she should have been made aware of. So this is the interesting thing about homosexuality and our understanding of it. I'm trying to be as matter of fact as possible. I know it's a very sensitive issue, not to diminish the due sensitivity required. So he writes as follows, and just to know, many people who are in the gay community are not so happy with Ramosha's tshuva on it. He has another tshuva, a tshuva about repentance to a young man who is gay, and he asked Ramosha Feinstein how to repent. So Ramosha Feinstein, he basically understands that homosexuality is a temptation, a choice, not something that people are involuntarily, or at very least he thinks that people would be bisexual. The idea of someone being inherently homosexual is not something that he seems to wrap his head around or really subscribe to, which I think most people at his time didn't subscribe to that either, certainly in the traditional world. So he writes as follows. He writes, if he's not someone who's constantly involving himself in homosexual activity, but he's done it a few times when the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, got the better of him. That's harder to say that it's grounds for retroactively dissolving the marriage. Even if doing it once, is a wicked thing to do, nonetheless, that's not enough. We're not going to say it's inherently part of his essence. Meaning there's a difference between, being someone who is a good person who sins every now and then versus being a sinner, where your essence now becomes you are a sinner. Most people are good people who sin from time to time, hopefully nothing significant. So that's the distinction he's drawing. But if we get the sense that he's so actively involved in this, that we get the sense that actually he's probably attracted to men more than he is to women, then actually that points to something that is inherently, I don't want to say part of his essence per se, but that's something that is more of a red flag that would be grounds for us to retroactively nullify the marriage. But he says, nonetheless, this is only if upon the woman learning about this activity, she immediately says, I want to separate from this guy. Because what's the point over here? It's not that this guy is a sinner and is not deserving of being married to her, therefore we annul it. It's not a moral discussion. This comes back to our transactional framework. When, Ruvain and Rachel decide to get married, they are entering into a contractual mutual agreement together. It's a very important business transaction taking place. So we're not trying to figure out is Ruvain a good guy or a bad guy? What we're trying to figure out is there enough of a red flag that had this been brought to the woman's attention, she would not have wanted to get married to him in the first place. And a good way to help determine that is if immediately upon learning this news about her husband, or she thought it was her husband, she immediately says, I'm done, I'm leaving. That would be grounds for us to help make the case that we can retroactively dissolve the marriage. So that's our Moshe Feinstein on Kiddushay Tos. All right, let me pause over there. I threw a lot of heavy stuff tonight. All right, a lot of heavy stuff. How you doing there, Sandy?
Somebody who's bisexual.
Yeah. So I think Ramosha kind of he doesn't use the term bisexual, but he seems to be discussing that. I think that's a little bit easier to wrap one's head around because, what is bisexual in the end of the day? Bisexual, from my understanding, and again, I'm not a psychologist or anything. My understanding is they are attracted to men, they're attracted to women. So there's no reason that a marriage of a bisexual man and woman cannot work out perfectly. You're going to say that he's attracted to men also. Well, a heterosexual man is attracted to other females, but he stays hopefully faithful to his wife. So I don't see, I think the bisexual is probably the easiest thing to deal with because the point is once you enter into a marital agreement with someone, you're supposed to stick with them. So, I guess that technically, makes the pool of potential people bigger, but I mean, a heterosexual male would also have to stay in his lane, if you know what I mean.
Rabbi, why is the big drive to try to annul things rather than just being able to give a divorce?
Excellent. So, Lee, you're asking the right question. It's only, I'm sorry I didn't emphasize this earlier. I should have if I didn't. These are in cases where we're having a hard time getting a divorce document. Oh, yeah. All these, every case we're dealing with, where the man is willing to meet with the rabbi and give a divorce to his wife, we could just table the whole halavai. That would be it. And then we don't have this year over here. I'd much rather that none of this ever had to be written. All these cases are non-conventional. So the case of the post-Holocaust, that's when the man is simply not around to give a get, and we don't know what happened to him. Now we're dealing with men who are being recalcitrant and refuse to give a get. So we're asking, what is our recourse? So one form of recourse is to retroactively annul it. But that doesn't always work. As we said, sometimes there isn't such a glaring red flag that there's a good basis for retroactively dissolving the marriage. So then the question is, what else do we have in our toolkit in such a situation? So let's go a little further. I think there will be a part 3 to this. So let's do one more section. We're going to talk about a method which people think gets used pretty often, but I've spoken with people who officiate divorces, and it's actually very rare. This helps a man. It's called a Heter, Meah, Rabbonim. So on a biblical level, biblically speaking, a man can unilaterally divorce a woman. However, came along in early medieval times a sage by the name of Rabbeinu Gershom.
Gershom, yeah.
Very good. And
polygamy too.
Yep, that as well. So he had, and also not reading other people's letters. So he had several edicts. One edict was against polygamy, and then together with that, they work in concert with each other. Not only did he ban polygamy, which the whole Ashkenazic world took on, and some elements, I think, of the Spartak world didn't get the memo on that one. So I think there's stories of people coming to the early state of Israel, and they're coming with their whole bunch of wives with them. There's stories about that. Yeah, very interesting, to say the least. And he also said a man cannot unilaterally divorce his wife. Mm-hmm. Until then, we have a ksuba. We have a special document that there's a certain amount of money that the man would have to pay the woman if he decides to divorce her. The document is to disincentivize divorce. But if he says, I'll pay the fee and decides to do it, he can unilaterally divorce her. However, came along Rabbeinu Gershom and said, nope, both parties need to consent. So on the original biblical level, a woman cannot divorce a man. But now he said also a man cannot unilaterally divorce his wife. So what do we do if a woman refuses to accept the get? So because this ban was only done at a later stage in the game, there was kind of what you would call, I guess, a safety valve that was inserted in there, which is that if he gets the signatures of 100, not like rabbis who got their smicha out of a gumball machine, but actual real modified rabbonim. So then he could get permission and he could basically go ahead, give a get, put it in escrow, I think is what you would call it, and then divorce his wife through those means. Now, I want to dispel a few rumors about this. Everyone's gonna say, hey, this is unfair. I mean, it is a little bit lopsided. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. But if we're looking at some of the chuvas about the Heter Meah Rabbonim, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes in Choshe Mishpachel Beis Simon Tes. The Indian Heter to Meah Rabbonim Lehutar Ba'oben Shula Hafses Isha B'Schusei Mamashla. We are not going to write. We're not going to sign on to this. Oh, sorry. Why is it called Heter Meah Rabbonim? Meah Rabbonim, 100 rabbis. The dispensation of 100 rabbis. So we will not do this if he owes her money. if based on the marital agreement, there is certain money that he owes to her that he's refusing to pay, we will not go ahead and sign our signatures onto this document until he pays what he's supposed to do, because he has an obligation still. Now, here's what gets really interesting. And I'm going to get a little trouble for this, but I just want to be intellectually honest. He writes, Avo bismanenu, that nowadays where we can't, where we don't always have the power in court to go ahead and to extract the money from the man, we could withhold the get until then. So this is interesting. I need to think about it more, because one of the ideas in the prenuptial agreement that Sandy that you referenced is that we shouldn't, discussions like money, discussions like custody should only be discussed after the get is given. They should not be used as chips. They should not be used as bargaining chips in order to give the get. Get should just be done and let all the bargaining happen afterwards. The interesting thing, right, because usually that's a disadvantage to the woman then, who's waiting on the get. The interesting thing is, I don't know if Ramosha weighs in on that part, but he weighs in on the opposite. And he says that the woman would have the right to refuse receiving the get until the man pays up. So it seems reasonable that at least Ramosha Feinstein would believe that it could run both ways, but I'm not certain about that. I'm not speaking prescriptively, I'm speaking descriptively here. Anyway, I'll just leave that one for consideration. But let's just wrap up this section over here, because I know we're coming to the end of our 45-minute slot, even though we started at
Rabbi, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If he wants a divorce, and according to the ketubah, he's supposed to pay money, and he says, okay, I'll grant you the divorce, but I'm not going to pay you, or I'll get it to you, and she wants to wait on that, that makes sense. It gives her, it's a positive way, a lever on that. So he fulfills his obligations.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I guess using the get as a bargaining chip seems to be an interesting. But you're saying since it's like Suba, since it's in there. Okay, I hear. Let me think about that more. That's a good.
It's an obligation.
Yeah, right. It's in like Suba itself. Okay, that's a fair point, Lee. Let me think about that more. Just to wrap up the Heter Meah Rabbonim discussion, right? Let's say we have a woman who is refusing to accept the get. So he writes that if a woman refuses to come to Beis Din at all, right? We're not talking about him refusing to pay up, but she's just refusing to cooperate with the Beis Din. Then, in that case, that's when they're allowed to do this 100 rabbi whammy. And the way it's done is that both the divorce document and the money that he would have to pay for the ksuba are put in escrow. That way, hopefully, when she decides to accept the get, it will be there. But in the meantime, he could go ahead with the Heter Meah Rabbonim in order to remarry. Let's see, two more sources over here coming into the final stretch. In Masoros Moshe, there's a lot about the Heter Meah Rabbonim. Masoros Moshe is Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, who was one of the grandchildren of Rav Moshe Feinstein. He was his right-hand man for the last years of his life. So now there are 5 thick volumes out there called Masoros Moshe, in which he records like every conversation. Basically, he was just like standing on Moshe's side, I think taking notes the whole time. It's really a treasure trove of material. So he writes that when Ramosha was asked to sign on a Heter Meah Rabbonim, he wrote, Shelo kedai sheyachtom rishon. He said, I don't want to sign first on it. Because then it looks like I'm agreeing with, apparently there was like a whole, not just the Heter Meah Rabbonim, but there was like a whole entire preamble about the particular situation. He said, oh, you stick me in like a number 73 or something. You signed the first guy on there. It looks like you concur with everything above. Thought that was an interesting point. But the last thing, just to emphasize from Masoros Moshe again, in the first volume, page Tuf Mem Beis 442, he writes, and we'll conclude with this: the Gampam Hisker Rabbeinu, Ramosha once remarked, Tehine Heter Meah Rabbonim rak havi Heter im maskim abal litin again. Again, the whole idea of the Heter Meah Rabbonim is only if the husband is willing, he consents to give the get, the kach os lemaisik shishvakish itema, and indeed he will give it when she requests it. Why? The ein ze heter la'agen isha, lest we believe, lest we think, lest we practice the heter me'Rabbonim as a way to leave this woman trapped in the marriage while he goes ahead and remarries, because technically polygamy is permissible on a biblical level. So that's not how it works. It's only if he fulfilled all of his obligations. He puts the money in escrow there. He takes care of the get. He did everything on his end. And for whatever reason, maybe to spite him, she doesn't want to accept the get. Then we do the heter me'Rabbonim if all else fails. But nonetheless, again, I just spoke to people who do this professionally. They say it's very rare to do a heter me'Rabbonim. Part of the reason might be also we're going to talk about some other methods. So the next question we're going to deal with, and this will be part 3 for next time, is what if this fails? Or what about for a woman who doesn't have the option of heter me'Rabbonim? And what if we can't nullify retroactively? So what still do we have in our toolbox? We'll talk about a number of unconventional methods. We'll talk about, but basically it's going to come down to the question of how coercive can we be while still counting it as the man's consent. So Sandy, you already brought this up. What about some sort of monetary coercion, or what we might call incentivization? What if we incentivize that if you give it to her, you will not have to pay more money? So we're going to talk about those other methods next time. And then also in that discussion, we'll hopefully wrap up with a broader discussion about Ramosha's philosophy toward Igun and divorce. And I'll try to slip in one more shiur before I go on vacation, because I'd hate to leave everyone hanging for like 2 weeks after this. But anyway, thank you guys for coming, and
thank you for taking
good learning
the time.
together tonight. Freilich and Hanukkah.
Good night.